Today we are being joined by Refugee Education UK, and we're looking at CPD for supporting refugees, which I know you'll all be looking forward to this afternoon. So thank you, and hopefully we'll have a great afternoon and we can have some questions at the end. Okay, I'll pass over to Refugee Education UK.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here. Before I share the slides and launch into the presentation, just introduce myself quickly. My name is Katie. I head up our education progression team, and I'm joined here this evening, by my colleague Hamid. So I'll hand over to you, Hamid, to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Hamid and I work for Refugee Education UK, and my role is Education Welcome Project Officer.
Hamid, I'll be doing the presentation, but Hamid will be very much available for questions. So Hamid can speak from his professional point of view, so he's worked with us for a while now. But Hamid also himself has lived experience of forced migration and of the education system. So he has sort of 2 points of view and 2 areas of expertise. So give me a moment to share the slides. I've introduced myself, but just to introduce the organisation as well. So I work for an organisation called Refugee Education UK. And at REUK, Refugee Education UK, everything we do is with the ultimate goal of helping refugees and asylum-seeking children and young people access education, thrive in education, and use that education for good. As I've said, I lead the Education Progression and Welcome team at REUK, and we work with children right the way from primary school all the way to university to help them overcome the multiple barriers that exist to accessing and progressing in education. We also support schools, colleges, universities, and the professionals that work within them to build the capacity to support refugee children through our research, our training, advice, and guidance. And it's worth saying that about half of our work focuses on access, so getting in the door, if you will, whether that's primary or further education college or university. And the other half of our work tends to focus more on what we call educational thriving. So what happens when they are in education, when they're in the door? And that might be in terms of well-being, psychosocial well-being, but also more directly academic outcomes. And interestingly, this split applies equally to our direct programmatic work, but it also applies really to our research and our training. We focus both on access and on thriving. So the welcome and progression element of our work, which is the part that I lead, our work is primarily around ensuring that young people and their families have both accurate information and then, if necessary, the right support to access the education that they're entitled to. So we do this through one-to-one casework, through group work, drop-in sessions. We facilitate a private scholarship for asylum seekers that wish to go to university and obviously are not able to fund that themselves because they aren't able to access student finance. And we also operate a national advice service, email and telephone. But alongside our direct work with young people, we also really strive to amplify their voices and the voices of frontline practitioners such as yourselves, supporting them through our research and advocacy, as well as using our sort of very specific expertise, which is in the crossover of education and forced migration, to train and equip schools, colleges and universities, as well as local authorities and NGO partners. And it's worth saying that our research is grounded in the practice and the lived experience of refugee and asylum seeking young people. And we do often carry it out in partnerships with other organisations and university partners. So before we start, and I suspect I'm preaching to the choir here, but I do just want to sort of play a little video of some of the young people we work with speaking about why education matters to them.
I care about education because I think it's important for some people, to get some sort of knowledge about something, and also for me, it makes me feel like I'm a smart, I'm a smart person. And yeah, that's it.
So I had to flee my country. And right now, through education, I'm trying to make the best out of the worst and become a functioning member of this country. That's why I care about education.
I believe that like education is the key of the world. The more you study, the more you're gonna learn, the more you're gonna be wiser, the more you will grow more and develop.
I feel like it's the key. I care a lot about it because it's the key for the world. I feel like education is an example of like you got many rooms with locked doors, and the more you educate yourself, the more keys you get. So it's not just about to get a good work or become a better person in the future. No, it's for you yourself to be educated, to not look like you don't belong, because people can talk about history and a lot of stuff. If you're not an educated person, you would be just sitting there not understanding anything. So it's a key of life.
So, as you've heard, education is hugely important to refugee and asylum-seeking children and young people. But there are also phenomenal challenges that they face in trying to access and thrive in education. So what we're going to do today is go through a really brief, and this is a real whistle-stop tour. I'm trying to cram a lot of material into about 20 minutes now. So we're going to go through a brief overview of children and families' likely previous experience, both of displacement and of education. Then we're going to look at some of those challenges I've just referenced. What are the most common educational challenges faced by refugee children? And looking at some key strategies that you could implement in your roles in schools. And then at the end, we're going to try and point you in the direction of any further support available. So let's start by looking at our first outcome to recognise the impact of pupils' prior experience of forced displacement and education. Of course, every child and young person's circumstances will differ, but in general, there are two key elements that you will need to consider to understand the likely context of the child and young person in front of you. Firstly, consider, did they arrive with their family or on their own? The majority of children will come with their families, but there's a smaller subset of probably slightly older children, maybe late teens would be typical age, who would arrive in this country without their parents or anyone else who can act in a parental capacity, and they will be looked after by the local authority. They're known as unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. The second thing that you should consider is, did the child or the young person arrive as part of a resettlement programme, or are they claiming asylum in this country? If the children arrived as part of a formal resettlement programme, such as those arriving from Afghanistan on the ARAP or the ACRS scheme, or a few years ago, those arriving under the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Scheme or Homes for Ukraine, those are all the sort of resettlement schemes that I'm talking about. There's much more likely to be both pre-departure support and particularly support on arrival in the UK. Whereas the families of and children who are claiming asylum have not come through a resettlement scheme receive almost no support. It's very, very much a two-tier system, and we shouldn't assume that all refugee children will be having the same experience. And we're going to think about all of this and how it impacts on their education. But in order to do that, we need to go back just a little bit further. So when we think of education pre-arrival in the UK, we potentially need to think of three different contexts. Countries of origin, where did they come from? The fact that they may well have spent years on the move, maybe living in camps, and thinking about what the education might have been like that. And all of this means disruption, that children's education is likely to have been hugely disrupted. Enrollment and completion rates are likely to be really low. Attendance is likely to have been affected both by conflict, but also by the moving from one country to another. But there's also likely to be a real sort of contrast between different countries. So we can't assume that the education in Afghanistan or in Ukraine or in Syria would all have been the same. Moving now on to outcome 2. What are the key challenges that may affect refugee children's education here? We've divided those challenges into academic challenges and well-being challenges. So it's worth saying we absolutely recognise that those challenges are completely interlinked and overlapping and can't ever be completely separated. But I do think it's still worth thinking about them as two separate things. So in looking at well-being challenges, what we're going to look at briefly is trying to understand the common causes of poor emotional and psychosocial well-being in resettled refugee children, and what you may see in the classroom as a result of this. Firstly, have a look at the table on the left. The 4 key things that pretty much any refugee or asylum-seeking child is likely to have experienced. So thinking, you know, to be honest, of any country, but let's focus maybe on Afghanistan as a concrete example. We all know that 18 months ago, whenever it was, there was a particular crisis that caused large numbers of people to flee that country. But actually, it's really important to remember that Afghan people have lived through decades of conflict and hardship. And it wasn't just the summer of 2021, which we may remember from the news. And what we see as a result of this is as we said, disrupted education. It's also important to remember that we do also see a remarkable resilience and determination and sense of hope. And I think, you know, we are talking a lot about trauma, but whilst we speak of the challenges, I think it's important to remember that. We also have not just the trauma of the past, but also potentially of the present, arriving in an unfamiliar country, being confined to a hotel, not being able to cook food you like, not really being able to control who's around you. It's incredibly unsettling for families, for parents, and for children, and has been described as an additional trauma. Not only that, but children are often moved from one hotel to another, and it maybe sounds strange to us, but the families themselves describe that as being as traumatic as whatever caused them to flee their country in the first place, that sense of putting down roots and then having to move on. And the issue of expectations and reality also comes in here. Like, whatever it was that people expected to get when they arrived in the UK, I'm not really sure it would have looked like sitting for sort of years now in a hotel room and not really knowing when that would give up. There's grief and anxiety, clearly. Grief for what they've given up, for the country they miss, the friends, the family, anxiety about what their loved ones, who they're not with, are going through. And then clearly isolation and loneliness. And I suspect it's not something that I have to tell you, that many refugee and asylum-seeking children can be very withdrawn. They can find it sometimes hard to interact with their peers, and at an extreme can be quite badly bullied. So moving on from the left-hand side to what you may see in the classroom as a result of that. So the fight or flight mechanism, we've all heard about this, I think, that when children have seen, witnessed, experienced serious trauma or violence, that their brains are very easily reactivated by things that may, to us, seem quite insignificant triggers. And when that happens, the sympathetic nervous system acts like a gas pedal, flooding the body with adrenaline, raising the heart rate, switching off the thinking part of the brain and putting all physical senses on high alert. And so you may actually see kind of quite extreme behavior in the classroom as a consequence of this. But the flight mechanism is interestingly linked to the same sort of hormonal response. So while some children might get quite aggressive or quite obviously distressed, others will just withdraw, disconnect, and it looks like very different behavior, but it's very, very much linked to the same trauma response in the child. And then maybe at a lower level, wellbeing challenges, the things we've talked about, can lead to reduced concentration and focus. So many of the children and young people we work with suffer from insomnia, find it difficult to sleep. Now, that may be because of trauma and distress, nightmares. It can sometimes be simply because their living arrangements actually make it really difficult for them to sleep. They're sharing the room with older siblings, the television's on with parents, they just don't have their own space. And they will be tired and sleepy in the classroom, maybe have poor attendance, or be arriving late at school. And then lastly, I suppose there's the most obvious one, which is just a very clearly and visibly distressed child. So in addition to the trauma and psychosocial well-being elements, there's also some quite clear academic challenges in the classroom. I won't dwell too much on these because I suspect you are very familiar with them, but language barrier is the most obvious one and has to be spoken about. And that's particularly compounded by the way that sort of EAL support in schools has been stripped back over the last sort of decade or so. It may well be that children are adapting to a new curriculum, a new learning style, a new sort of way of doing school. And it's quite typical that children maybe come from more traditional sort of rote learning type environments and find the more critical, discursive approach in the UK education space difficult to engage with initially. And then finally, again, I know a huge lack of resource and SEND generally across the UK, but there are particular difficulties in diagnosing and addressing this in children, A, for whom English is not the first language, and B, who are also experiencing trauma. And then, of course, there are the sort of academic challenges outside of the classroom, which I've already alluded to, that many of these children are not living in anything like an adequate, appropriate environment for home study. They may well not have access to the internet. We know many, many children who they're all sort of sharing a family phone to try and do homework. A lack of parental support or engagement. And I want to emphasize that this is not because parents don't care. In fact, I would say most refugee and asylum seeking parents care desperately about their children's education. And that is a key element in why they decided to come to the UK, is because they believe that their children will have better opportunity here. But the trauma we've spoken about also impacts them, that many of these children, these parents, are completely bewildered by life in the UK. They typically, especially, I'm generalizing here, but maybe especially mothers, will not speak English. And because they're often looking after many other children as well. And so all of these challenges make it incredibly difficult for them to offer the support and the support that we would ideally want parents to offer. And then another key, very obvious issue is potential poverty. In fact, especially with asylum seeking families, that is highly likely to be the case, and that will affect transportation to school, ability to buy school uniforms. It will affect maybe nutrition even, and certainly ability to take part in sort of extracurricular activities or sort of social activities with other children. So moving now on to outcome 3, which is trying to think about, well, okay, after all of this sort of slightly depressing picture that I'm painting for you, what can you do as educators to support the refugee children that you're working with? And I suppose it's important to stop here and say there is no one size fits all. I'm not going to be able to give you, I don't think anyone can, do this and you will get this result. But I think there are some sort of key principles that we would want to emphasize. And these are very much drawing on our experience with our casework and our young person facing work, but also on our research. So the first one, and I do recognize as well that some of them are quite obvious, but they are really, really worth taking on board. Now, I understand that teachers and anyone in school will want to build trust with every pupil, whatever their background. But I think it's particularly important with refugee and asylum seeking families, and it may take longer than you're used to, but as someone working in education, you have a unique opportunity to build an example of welcome and of special care, helping the children and their parents feel valued, seen, listened to. I think the next one is, I suspect, in line with every behaviour policy across the country. But again, when behaviour is particularly acute, it's really important to remind ourselves to look beyond the behaviour to what may be causing it, and seek to address it, if possible, in collaboration with other staff, particularly if you do have any sort of mental health, therapeutic support within your school. Recognise language level is not ability level. This is so crucial. And again, it sounds obvious, but I have to say, time and time again, we see that it's not happening. Now, of course, children who don't speak English are going to struggle immensely at the beginning, but that is not synonymous with low intelligence. And we do often find that children who have a low level of English language ability, it means that somehow their abilities in other subjects, in maths or in music, are overlooked. And I think, fourthly, and this is my personal favourite, try and adopt an assets-based approach. And what I mean by that is almost to reframe refugee children in your school or in your college or in your environment as being a positive thing. It's an opportunity for other children to learn more about the world, to develop compassion. It's the local secondary school, actually, to me, and I live in an area with quite a high number of refugees and asylum seekers. And when we interviewed our local secondary school head, he said that taking on refugee and asylum seeking students was the single most important thing he had done to raise aspiration across the school. And I think that attitude, notwithstanding the challenges, but that attitude is just such an important one. In terms of teacher approaches, when you're responding to that fight or flight mechanism I was talking about earlier, there's a couple of really useful pointers that try not to allow yourself to be sort of deregulated and escalated by whatever's happening to the child. Recognize that it's a trauma response, so maintain a really calm and gentle voice with really slow movements. If you possibly can, create a safe space for the child, moving them away from other children. Recognize that they won't be able to talk, even if their English is good, that their thinking part of their brain is completely switched off. So it's actually much better to give them a really simple, repetitive task to do. Can you just sort these pencils into colours for me? You know, meaningless tasks will be something that helps them regulate their emotions until they're able to maybe talk to you about what on earth happened to cause that reaction. Be aware of sensitive topics. So things like journeys to the UK, about their family, about the situation in their home countries, and particularly family. I'm aware that it's a topic that we reach for quite normally in sort of everyday conversation to talk to people, you know, oh, how many sisters and brothers do you have, whatever it may be. Sometimes you'll be talking to people who have lost close family members or are really worried about their safety. So just be cautious about that. And I think, yeah, having time to talk. I mean, we've sort of touched on this, and making referrals. So internal referrals, brilliant. If you do have a therapeutic service within your school, I would absolutely personally refer every asylum seeking refugee child to that off the bat. But also external referrals. Like, there are a lot of good organisations in the charitable sector or whatever it may be. What is there that you can help the young person you're working with or their family by referring them to? Now that we've looked at some of these sort of principles for interaction and teacher behaviour, we're going to share some ideas for things that schools could be doing to support refugee pupils. So let's have a look. What's the first one? Peer support. So the research that we do shows that schemes like buddy schemes can make a really, really big difference to refugee children's ability to settle in. Now, ideally, you'd be wanting to match a child with a child of the same gender, considering Many of those children might be coming from single-sex schools, if they're coming from slightly more conservative countries, but same language would be fantastic, sort of cultural background if you had that. But actually all of that pales into insignificance compared to a child who wants to do it, who's kind and who's friendly. That is just really, really crucial. What comes next? A period of adjustment. So just recognizing that for many of these children, they will not be able to switch to the UK system quickly. It really does need a period of adjustment where you'll have to sort of be flexible in your approach. Strong pastoral care and wellbeing support are really, really important. Make sure that the children know who they can turn to if they want to talk to someone. Linking them up, we talked about internal support, but particularly if they don't speak English, go out of your way to make sure that they know who it is, that you've introduced them to that person. What can you do generally to make your school more welcoming and including? So bear in mind their cultural and religious needs. If you're working in a school that is not in a particularly diverse area, what can you do to really make it clear that you welcome people from their country, from their culture, from their religion? So really simple things are sort of language signs, saying hello. Have you thought through things like cultural and religious needs, halal food, religious holidays? And, you know, for example, don't just assume that if you've got Ukrainians in your school that because it's a Christian country or a country with a Christian heritage, they will necessarily celebrate the same holidays that we do in the UK. That might not be the case. They might be on different days, follow a different calendar. So just do everything you can to understand the culture and the background of the children you're working with and how you can meet them halfway, I suppose, in making them feel welcome in your school. Language support is, I know, in some ways blindingly obvious, but it is really, really crucial. We always signpost people to the Bell Foundation resources, amazing organisation, and also NALDIC, who have loads of advice sheets and ideas for creative EAL support. Could you also consider sort of setting up language support clubs for your children? What other creative things can you do to help them sort of supercharge their English language learning? Is there reading buddies, like just all sorts of ideas? And then any extracurriculum support. So mentoring, we run a mentoring program, and if you're in parts of the country where we run that, I'd really recommend that. But you could set one up in your school as well, or there are many other organisations out there that do fantastic academic mentoring. Is there something available that you could match your children up with? But I would also say that alongside the children, actually the parents are just as important. What can you do to support your parents? Now, clearly language support. So can you consider using interpreters for key meetings? Obviously, this will come with a cost, but are there any other families within the school or within the community that could support? And I recognise, you know, you have to think about privacy, but in many instances, that will be fine. It's not highly confidential information that's being shared. Even if that doesn't work, or you do think there's real privacy issues there, just having a tablet with Google Translate ready is such a sort of important way of indicating that you really want to engage despite the language barrier. Can you think about translating newsletters and messages to family into appropriate languages? Because all these things are going to make a really big difference to how engaged the parents are, which will then make a big difference to how engaged the children are. Helping the families adjust. So many aspects of the British education system are going to be completely new for their families. So could you organise a tour of the school, for example, specifically for some of these families? Can you really plan in sufficient time for building relationship with his parents, and kind of explaining things that will be very obvious to maybe British families that have been in the country longer, but may not be obvious? So, for example, the length of the school day, the expectation that children do come to school in compulsory, if they're of compulsory school age, is not necessarily something that you should take for granted. That People aren't allowed unauthorized absences. These are really important things. Can you build in some sort of social aspect? Could you have a coffee morning, explain to them what their children are learning and how they can help? All of these things will just make such a big difference. Technology support, again, a bugbear of mine. I think even as a parent who is relatively well educated and has English as a first language, I find the level of the app that I'm supposed to engage with quite overwhelming. And I think it's almost impossible for refugee and asylum seeking families who will have less technology. They may well just be sharing one phone, English as a second language, if they speak it at all, to expect them to interact with those apps. So as staff in the school, what are you going to do to support the parents to access that or to receive the information that the school is typically giving parents through those platforms? And as we said with the children, signposting them to further support. So we talked, for example, about poverty. Now, we have to be very sensitive about that. I'm not saying that you should signpost every asylum-seeking family to a food bank or, a second-hand clothing store or whatever. Of course, we have to respect people and be really sensitive. But it is worth bearing in mind that it may be helpful to recognise that those sorts of services could be needed in a really discreet, gentle, supportive way. If necessary, be ready to point the families where they may need extra help. Okay, I'm 4 minutes over, so I'm gonna end there. Just by saying, please do sign up to follow us. As you can see, it's welcome training resources, our hello at email. We'd love to hear from any of you in any capacity. And to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And finally, my comms manager would kill me if I didn't share with you that we are, in the moment, we're trying to launch a campaign to get 50 new donors in 50 days. So if you're minded to do so, we would love if you would be willing to donate to us, and the QR code is there. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing, and Hamid and I are very much available for any questions.